On behalf of the Advocacy Committee, I welcome you guys. Lisa Dillard and I put on the panel last January 22nd. Hopefully a lot of you were able to attend. If not, it is posted on the church website. It's an hour worth spending. It was fantastic. We had 4 great speakers and an incredible moderator talking about ways the faith communities are making an impact in affordable housing in Charlotte. As a continuation of that conversation, we have 2 more incredible people for you. One may seem familiar because he's been in the halls quite a bit, but that seems like a lot. I've recognized Hannah as well. Today, we're going to dial it in a little more and talk more about how as individuals, we can understand our neighbors better and make a more individual impact. Let me give you a little background because they've done a lot. Justin Perry is founder of Perry Counseling, Healing, and Recovery, where he and his clinical team use talk, art, and movement modalities to treat individuals 12 and up, as well as families who struggle with shame, insecurity, and personal relationships. In the space of mental health, substance abuse, and trauma, they seek to promote healing and end stigma. He's previously run groups at his alma mater, West Charlotte High School, offering support to freshmen and sophomores who need extra support with communication, conflict resolution, and healthy relationship skills. Louder.
Please.
Maybe I'll pass it on to everyone.
Yeah. I mean, you're okay, it's fine, yeah.
Girl, I wasn't supposed to talk loud. He's provided trauma-informed, training for teachers, administrators, and support staff at various Charlotte and Mecklenburg schools, as well as other school districts around North Carolina. As an advocate for social justice, he does speaking engagements, including some here at First Pres, and racial equity consultation and workshops around the state and country, at times partnering with the Educational Equity Institute. Justin is a proud Charlotte native who served as student leader intern at Charlotte's First Freedom School in 2002 before earning his Bachelor's of Arts degrees in psychology and sociology, as well as his Master's of Social Work, all from UNC Chapel Hill. Pause for applause. Multiple publications and has previously done a monthly column as a guest columnist for Charlotte Observer, Raleigh News, and the Observer Durham Herald Sun. He's co-founder of One MEC, a grassroots organization which focuses on increased equity and integration in education and housing. And Perry served in numerous boards, including actively serving on the board for the Community Building Initiative Center, as well as UNC School of Social Work Board of Advisors. Perry has won several awards, including Charlotte Observer's 7 to Watch, UNC School of Social Work English Alumni, Playing for Others Night of Gratitude Honoree, and the Southern Living Magazine's Top 50 Southerners of the Year, all in 2016. And Charlotte's Association of Fundraising Professionals National Philanthropy Day Champion of Diversity in 2022. Off the field, Perry's happily married, father of 2, and a passionate sports fan. Hannah Beavers has spent over a decade working in the social impact and holistic community development space as a nonprofit founder, executive director, board member, and consultant. Hannah's passion is connecting people to the resources they need to live thriving lives. Today, she inspires and spearheads change as the executive director of Freedom Communities, which now has a permanent tie to our beloved Lakewood Preschool. Hannah lived in 6 countries as a child and speaks 4 languages. This multicultural background ingrained her fierce advocacy for social justice and gave her the ability to understand and solve problems holistically. Hannah received her BA from Boston College in Finance, Operations, and Russian. Upon graduation was accepted into General Electric's Financial Management Program. Before beginning her career with GE, Hannah volunteered in Tanzania and founded a nonprofit organization to support a local woman caring for orphans and vulnerable children. Upon returning to the US, she began her career with GE and simultaneously began building her organization. Hannah left GE after spending 5 years in various finance roles and leading multi-billion-dollar business integrations to pursue her passion full-time. Prior to joining Freedom Communities, she led the international nonprofit Mama Hope as Chief Operating Officer, supporting 22 communities worldwide to build sustainable social businesses and communities. She also serves on the board of directors for Stiletto Bobs University, an entrepreneurship training program for high school girls. now that we're all amazed and humbled. Turn it over to them. We're kind of going to be casual about this, but I'm going to throw a few questions at them that to kind of see how much we can cover in the brief 1 hour we have with them. So maybe just start by giving a quick overview of, for Justin, 1 MEC, which the advocacy committee is starting to be more involved with. Right now, we're more listening and taking y'all's lead. And Hannah talking about Freedom Communities and some of the work you've done there.
I go first after that bio, so.
I say, see again, I'm the Southern gentleman, I'm like ladies first, right? All right, when she says go, I gotta go, so, all right. So yeah, so the 1 MEC, just created, I guess, 2015 or so. And it was actually born out of recognizing the resegregation of our schools. And so again, you know, I'm somebody, again, I grew up here in Charlotte, and I was telling people all the time that my sophomore year in high school, I had to meet Rosa Parks because she came to West Charlotte because it had been once known as a, you know, a national model around desegregation. And then the year later, the Capaccione case was being launched to end desegregation. And I was meeting James Ferguson and protesting at a courthouse and those things like that. But, you know, again, what we thought would happen in terms of our schools being deeply segregated, even more so, took place. And so 2015, we decided to be a part of trying to take steps to help the reintegration of our schools with student assignment plan. And it was just an organic meeting that took place at a person's house. It was Carol Sawyer. I never even met her before. And there was just a lot of different people that were there that were passionate about it. And so what we looked at was that we need to look at multiple phases. We need to look at what's going on from the school aspect, but we also need to look at what was going on from the housing and neighborhood development aspect. And so we kind of helped craft a plan that looked not only at student assignment, but also how do we include the city, the county commission, everybody else like that to look at neighborhood development, housing development, and having more mixed income, things of those things as well. And so that's something we've really been deep in the housing work, especially over the last 5 years. And so even the shift in the paradigm about what affordable housing is, where we actually are short on it, because last time we used that term broadly, but a lot of people didn't realize where were our greatest shortages. And so things like, you know, now we kind of use 30% AMI as kind of this, people just use it a lot, but that wasn't happening before. We wanted to really do stuff to shift the paradigm, but also to engage not only local government, but also faith houses. Because one of the things we know is that the largest amounts of land that's available to be utilized in this is often at our churches, you know, and again, we're blessed in this community to have a lot and blessed to have a lot of land. And so we want to kind of create a space to figure out how do we partner at a government level, at a, you know, spiritual level, as well as at a philanthropic and business level and everything. And so that's part of the work we're doing with 1 MEC, just kind of at a high level. As Michelle said, we're proud to have First Pres engaged now and being able to take things to another level because we realize that advocacy is very important in this work.
Absolutely. And a lot of what Justin hit on is so really important to the work that we do at Freedom Communities. Were started as a nonprofit, officially became a nonprofit in 2018. And we, I'm echoing, no? Okay. And when we got started, one of the things we wanted to figure out was, with our limited money, what can we do to make the most investment? And this was on the heels of the Keith Lamont Scott shooting, and of course the Chetty study. And one of our founders went around the country to visit different community development initiatives to understand, you know, what ingredients of those initiatives were actually making a dent on generational poverty. And he came back and he said, look, if you guys are going to do anything, don't spread yourself across the city. Choose a particular area and go deep in that area, kind of like what you guys have done with Westerly Hills. And so that you can go deep and work holistically with the families that live there. And so based on some of the relationships that we had in the Freedom Drive corridor in West Charlotte, that became the area of our focus. And obviously there were many organizations and community leaders that had been doing amazing work far before that we arrived. And so one of our first our charters was to try to figure out, who are these amazing individuals? What are the assets already existing within this community? And what are some of the gaps? And we continually heard about third grade reading proficiency, which you guys are well familiar with. And at that time, one of the schools that we partnered with, only 15.6% of kiddos could read proficiently within third grade. And this is pre-COVID. And so again, on the heels of Project Lift and so much amazing work that had been done to invest in schools and educators. And we simply asked, what else do we need to know? And we continually heard about how intrinsically linked education is to stable housing. And that in a population of rising rents and relatively stable wages, this was causing families to have to search for housing, causing displacement of families from their homes and of course children from their schools. And this was having a negative impact, not only in those babies who had to leave their homes, but it also had a really difficult impact on teachers. And I heard we have a teacher in the room and how that impacts the students and the teachers in the classroom. And so one of the first things that we did was decided to focus on affordable housing. One of our founding board members began to develop affordable housing. Tim Sidema is the managing partner of Crosland Southeast, and he develops the housing and we own the housing. And to date, we've opened 504 units of affordable housing. These are funded through LIHTC dollars that you guys have probably heard about, the Charlotte Housing Opportunity Investment Fund, the Housing Trust Fund. But we also know that rentals don't help folks to generate wealth. And so last year, we formed a joint venture partnership with Habitat for Humanity of Greater Charlotte, and we purchased 23 units of housing in our community. These are NOAA units, you might naturally occur in affordable housing. And our goal is to move those to affordable home ownership over a 10-year period, prioritizing current tenants, as well as those who live within our community. And then lastly, we purchased the land right across the street from Westerly Hills where that big ravine is. We just purchased that and we'll be developing affordable townhomes on that land in partnership with True Homes. So that's really our affordable housing bucket. And over the next few years, we'll be opening a couple hundred more units of housing. Secondly, you mentioned Lakewood Preschool. Well, our heartbeat is also early childhood education. In addition to learning about how important housing was to third grade reading proficiency, we also learned that 80% of a child's brain develops by the age of 3. Okay, so I have 2 kids, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And when I found that out, it really convicted me. We did a study with Child Care Resources and found out that the corridor where we work was actually a desert for quality early education, specifically for 0 to 3-year-olds. 5.6 kids were vying for 1 slot of quality early education. And at that same time, we found out that there was a leader who had lived in the community. She lived there for 30 years. And her preschool was generating some of the best readers at one of our neighborhood schools. And so we figured out who she was and went to meet her and realized that she was incredible. Her name's Gloria Dukes. She has a huge passion for the work. And one of the very first investments that we made was to purchase a church. And we opened a preschool. We expanded her existing capacity to add 70 additional slots of early education for 0 to 3-year-olds. And we opened that center in January. And when the Lakewood Preschool closed its doors, we were able to find homes for those children in our school and partner school. And also the funds went to open 2 new classrooms and a formal entrance for our preschool building. So please come visit us. We'd love to see what your investment did there. But an incredible leader, her daughter-in-law, Gloria's daughter-in-law, is actually leading our center. So it's a great spot. And lastly, and then I'll stop talking about freedom, but we realized that in the 28208 zip code, which is where we work, 54% of the heads of household were single moms. And as a mom myself, knowing how hard it is with support, I realized that, these moms have the most potential to impact that next generation, but they have the least amount of time and they have the least amount of access to the resources to do so. And so we launched a program in July of 2020. You guys remember what it was like back then, called Moms Moving Forward, to equip single mothers and their children with the support network, because they're doing this program together, about 15 women at a time, support network, the tools and the resources to move their whole families forward. And to date, we've impacted 311 women and children through that program. So we love the work, and there's such a need for advocacy in the work that we're doing. So I really respect Justin, and our daughters actually were in the same class at our preschool. So we did a lot of swing pushing together and talking about these issues. So.
Well, no, and just kind of speaking off of this, and obviously Michelle's gonna ask us questions, but Hannah also kind of talk freely as well. Early childhood education is one of those things that I'm very passionate about, in large part because my wife has worked in that field for some time now. I'm not allowed to say how long with my wife, but so she was a teacher in the beginning, right? For 5 years, she taught at Hope Haven Child Development Center in Thompson Child. Now it's Thompson Child and Focus, their child development center. And one of the things we know is that one of the least financially supported industries is early childhood education. And the reality of what teachers make is in the 20s, and they still don't have health care. They often fall in that thing we call the donut hole, which is where you make too much to actually get Medicaid, but you don't actually get benefits. And so a lot of the people, when we talk about who's looking for affordable housing, like we had this kind of myth, right? We had this myth that is quote unquote a bunch of lazy, all kinds of pejorative terms we have, right? And it helps us sleep at night. It allows me to feel good that it's like, well, I know I worked hard and they didn't work hard, so that's why they're out here. But the reality is that a lot of the people that we're talking about are the people who are making sure that our kids not only are somewhere stable, but their brains are developing exactly as Hannah said. Somebody who's worked in attachment for almost 20 years now, what you said about that first 3 years is absolutely fact, right? And so that means even with the great thing we're doing of universal pre-K here in this county, which is a great thing, that still doesn't touch the 0 to 3. And I need people to hear that, because I think sometimes when we talk about it, we kind of like, all right, cool, we did that, we're good now.
Yeah.
But we've got all of this right here. And again, as one of the few states remaining who has not expanded Medicaid, again, a lot of these women who have basically taken care of the kids of people in here, the grandkids of people in here, often at the expense of their own families. Are you hearing that?
Yeah.
And we have to, and I have to say that out loud because, and some of you are used to me, so you kind of know. But I'm kind of direct. But I think the other thing we have to look at is if you go in classrooms, go to a bunch of childcare centers around this community. Look at who the teachers are in there. Look at what the demographics are. Who are the majority of teachers in those classrooms? What are the demographics? Let's see what people we got in the audience. We got some smart folks in here. What
Female.
Female, yes.
Or
People of color.
People of color, primarily Black and brown women. And I have to say that, I have to name that, because if you think about this, I mean, and again, this is why people like to talk about history, but go back to our history, right? We literally were built on Black women taking care of the kids of Hannah.
Yeah.
And their kids kind of suffering, right? And we kind of were comfortable with that. And so now when we see women that again fit the same demographic, taking care of Hannah's kids, educating Hannah's
Your kids too.
I know, exactly. Hey, just sit with it right now, Hannah. Just sit with it, all right? Absolutely, that's why I'm fighting for it, right? 100%, 100% my kid. I went to First Methodist when I grew up here, right? So again, childcare matters, right? But that's what allows us to have a career, to do all these other things. But then you got the other end of the spectrum, all right? I have a loved one who was recently in one of our kind of nursing home facilities. Go there. Who are the majority of people in there? Guess what? They're in that same wage system, the same lack of healthcare and everything else like that. And so what we're saying is that we can have folks take care of our loved ones at the most vulnerable ends of the spectrum when they're children and then when they're older adults. But the market doesn't justify us paying them a living wage. And even if that, then we can't allow them to live in our neighborhoods. Are y'all following that? Like, cause we can learn all the technical stuff.
Yeah.
And we can talk the technical stuff all day, but it's about a paradigm shift. And we're in a church. So again, I think when we talk about things like loving our neighbors as ourselves, again, we use that all the time. You guys ever heard that, love your neighbor as yourself?
Yeah.
I was like, in a Presbyterian church, there's no way you have it, right? You know, I'm sure Penn has used that a time or two. But I mean, really, what does that mean? Like, so the reality is when the pandemic at its peak was going on, and a lot of us were moving to virtual, and we really had no idea what was going on with this thing. A lot of these women were having to go into the classrooms with our snotty-nosed kids, right? Not knowing and having to worry about whether they're exposing their families when they go back home. We use terms like essential. These are essential workers. We called them heroes back then, right? But then when it comes time to actually invest in these folks who allowed us to continue living, what happens? Are we really loving our neighbors as ourselves? Or are we kind of using them for convenience? And so I think it's important for us to talk technically, but I think it's really important for us also to name it, because again, when we go into who are the people with the greatest need in terms of housing, it's Black mothers with children. And I gotta say that. I gotta say that out loud. And again, there's a lot of mothers that are doing things to make everybody's life in here more convenient.
Yes.
All right. So I love you all, but we have to be honest. All right.
And I think that's one of the primary reasons why we chose specifically to work with women and children in our corridor, because we realized that they were one of the most underinvested groups of people who, again, had the most potential to make that impact. And we've been at this now for a few years, and just some of the hurdles that our moms are having to jump over and walls that they're hitting are almost unfathomable when we think about them. And I want to share one example. I actually called one of these moms yesterday to make sure I had the details of her story straight. And so her story goes like this. She was a hardworking mother of two daughters, and she was working as a store manager at Popeyes. And she really wanted to better herself and the lives of her children. And she had a pain in her side, a really bad pain. And she said, what I learned is, Black women, we just work through the pain because we ignore it. And she said, I ended up going to the doctor eventually, and I realized that I was pregnant, and I had an ectopic pregnancy.
Oh.
And she said that it had actually burst in her, really something bad. So she had to go get emergency surgery, okay, and get one of her ovaries removed. And when she gets back home, during this time, she hasn't been able to work. Okay, so she wasn't able to pay her rent. So as soon as she gets back home, she goes to the mailbox and she has a letter from the sheriff's department saying that she's been evicted from her home. And she said, the fact that I had to tell my girls that after everything that I have been through, let alone hormonally, she said, it just broke my heart. She said, good thing though, I had about $200 saved so that I could buy a U-Haul, rent a U-Haul to come pick up my stuff and put my things in storage. So she goes and lives with one of her boyfriend at the time's house. And she's enrolled into our Moms Moving Forward program. And she said, it was so hard, but I was so committed to bettering myself. And she says, it seemed like everything that was offered was perfect for what I needed. And somebody from Charlotte Works came and she enrolled in a dental program where she ended up getting a 3.7 GPA, getting a job as a dental assistant. She was able to pay off her eviction and she was able to boost her credit score. And then when we opened this affordable housing, she became the very first person who qualified.
Great.
And when she was ready to get her keys, they said, "I'm so sorry, ma'am, you don't actually qualify." And she said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, you don't have 12 months of rental history that's not with family or friends. You don't qualify." And so I was furious and I picked up the phone and I called
Up for the church house.
furious.
Yeah.
And I called the regional VP of the leasing agency and I said, "Look, like you've got to make an exception." And so they put our name on some list that once you're on it, you can override that requirement, override that system requirement. And so she becomes the first person to move in. Her wages go up significantly. And then she loses her food stamps. And now she can't afford to pay for food for her daughters. So she takes on another job and now she's working both at, she's continuing to increase her wages within her job at the dentist office. And she's also working at the Mellow Mushroom in Myers Park, overseeing the kitchen. Okay. And her daughter, one of her oldest daughters is about to go to high school. We were talking about scholarship programs for her daughter, and her youngest is taking advantage of different opportunities in the community. And she found out about the housing that we would be opening that would be for sale. And she said she was the first person to sign up for the class to learn how to become a homeowner. She's still living in the housing. She's on the path to becoming a homeowner. And that is a success story. But think about the number of hurdles that she had to jump through. These are not people who don't care, who are not working hard. They're working extremely hard. And I think one of the things that, you know, we talked a lot about was the benefits cliff, which I think is a really poignant thing that we should all know about in this room. We can. What's that?
It's one of the handouts.
It is, yes. So, sure, yeah, we can do that. But one of the things that we often think about is, well, you know, there's plenty of jobs. Why doesn't somebody just get one of those jobs and they can increase their income? And then we can actually, you know, then we'll be in a good place. Well, if we go to the next one, it's sort of the story that I want to tell, but you know, at the very bottom, we have to, as Justin was talking about, we have to acknowledge this, like, this trauma that folks have. A lot of generational poverty causes trauma, right? It actually impacts brain development. And we have to actually, and Justin can talk a lot more about this than I can. But it impacts a person's mindset significantly. And so in our work, when we think about getting somebody a better paying job, we have to look at a couple different factors. Number one, does that individual have their GED? Okay, because a lot of our moms that we serve don't. A lot of moms in the neighborhoods that we work in do not have their GED. And if you go underneath that, one of the reasons why they don't have their GED is because they actually can't read proficiently at that level, a lot of adults. But let's say that they do have their GED. Now there's things like interviewing skills, what to wear, those are soft skills. Let's get those, you know, out of the way. Okay, we can get that, we can make that happen. Now, does somebody have a car? Do they have access to transportation? Is their house or where they live in their job on the bus line? Do they have childcare? Have they put their name on the waiting list like I had to do when I was 7 weeks pregnant to get a slot at a childcare center? Now, let's say that they get that all in order and they're doing great at their job and they've got little babies in childcare. Well, as soon as they begin to make over $16 and about 75 cents an hour, they lose 100% of their childcare benefits. So we're talking 1 cent over. And so let's say they're making $32,000 a year. Now they got to pay, if they've got one kid, about $12,000 a year for childcare. If they got two kids, $24,000 a year for childcare on a $32,000 a year salary. It's absolutely financially impossible. And that doesn't even account for food, rent, all of those other critically important things. So we work with a population of people who cannot afford to take a raise. Because in doing so, they become worse off financially, which is incredibly important to understand. So that's just what I want to say. Because one more thing, sorry, because we know that a person's income impacts the housing that they can afford, right? And then the housing that we afford impacts the neighborhoods that we can live in.
Yes.
And the neighborhoods we live in impact the schools that our children are zoned for. And the schools that our children are zoned for impact oftentimes the quality of education that they receive. So these are really, really, really important factors. And we think about housing, but underneath housing, there's these insidious systemic issues that we have to talk about, we have to raise awareness about, we have to address. So there's my soapbox.
Local, national, is it North Carolina?
Yes,
Yeah.
the child care benefit is yes.
It's all of the systems play out different ways in this. So I mean, North Carolina, so there's multiple levels. So if you talk about like childcare and everything else like that, just as a nation, we don't invest in it the way other developed countries do. Like if you look at around, like it doesn't make sense. Like if you look at every other developed nation compared to what we put in, we are at the bottom, right? And so then you throw that piece in, you throw in again the healthcare piece, you throw all of these things, they all kind of play out together. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's important. I think people get caught up when they hear the word politics or political or something like that. A lot of people get triggered, right? But the harsh reality is that all of these things are built out of policies. You know, and I'll go back to an MLK quote that doesn't get mentioned very often, is he talks about philanthropy, and he says philanthropy is commendable, but philanthropy should not allow the philanthropists to forget and not understand the economic injustices that make philanthropy necessary. And so when we talk about this generational poverty, we also got to have conversations about generational wealth. And I think it's important. And one of the things, like for me, it's never about, it's not about trying to figure out how to make people feel bad. It's how do we educate ourselves and mobilize ourselves, right? And so a task that I have for everybody in here is to do a deep dive at where does your family's wealth come from? Like, and again, I think it's just very important to recognize there's so many things, like even like if I look at the deed on my house, and now it says I'm supposed to be sold to someone of the Caucasian race, you know, we broke through down the road, right? So, but again, understanding like a lot of the neighborhoods that a lot of folks in here live in have those kinds of deeds on them, right? If we think about the reality of like both of my granddads both fought for this country, but they couldn't benefit from the GI Bill the way other folks did, right? Land grant. Have any of y'all ever heard of a land grant? All right. What does it mean to grant something?
Yeah.
To give, right? It's given from the government, which would be like a government handout. But we don't use it that way when we talk about the land that, again, like my wife's, her family, there's a land grant right here that says this, right? Whereas again, I had families to share properties and things like that. So what they weren't working and what they doing those things, but they cannot build wealth. And so again, it's generational poverty, but generational poverty also happens in response to generational wealth. Are y'all following that? And it's not saying that people didn't work hard still, but it's saying that it's still a different game. So it didn't matter that I got those degrees from UNC Chapel Hill or whatever else like that. In the end, I was not at the same starting place as my wife from my financial place, even though we were in the same second grade class together. So we've been at the same place for a long time, right? You know, and so when we first bought our house in 05, because at that point I recently moved into a house that her dad was renting, and I was like, I'm not putting money in his pocket, we're gonna get our own or whatever else like that if we're gonna do this. The reality is, he gave, I can just say it at this point, it was a $10,000 loan or whatever else for us to be able to put a down payment on the house, because even the early childhood educator making like 27,000, she was making more than I was, working in the mental health field at Thompson Child and Family Focus, where I negotiated to 23.5 before I started making overtime. All right, and those are with degrees, right? And so I would say we have to say these things because, again, it's not just education level, it's not just income level. We're also starting at different places. And so the last thing I'll just say really quickly there is, everybody talks about financial literacy. This is the financial literacy we need. It's not like when Hannah's talking about folks doing what they're doing, and we talk about resilience, we're talking about people who are already highly resilient. I mean, like the things that we're talking about, somebody navigating and jumping around and everything else like that. Like right now, I'm inconveniently living out of my house for 2 weeks to get some things done or whatever. And my son was like, and now we're like in this little 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house right there, which will make my house look massive now with a 3-2, right? My son's like, these 2 weeks are gonna be brutal. And I was like, what? I was like, no, bro. I was like, no. I was like, this is gonna be inconvenient. You still be able to be on the same bus stop. There are a lot of folks that have to move got to go to a shelter. And a lot of shelters, like I wouldn't be able to be there because the dad can't be there. There's so many layers to all of these kinds of things that, again, we're not understanding when we talk about this, when we use terms like resilience and financial literacy. I think it's important to really understand these systems, and that somebody working to quote unquote better their situation may now all of a sudden not have healthcare. And healthcare and medical bills are the #1 source of bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So actually, it's actually a financially literate decision to not take that race.
Yeah.
Because you're actually losing more than you're gaining.
Well, I think one of the things that we were talking about was how there's this entire hotel industry that people are unaware of, that when folks, they can't find anywhere to afford to live, and they may have an eviction on their record because they're living from paycheck to paycheck, and they weren't able to meet rent for whatever reason, whether it was a medical situation or otherwise. We find that so many of the families that we serve are making a hotel their home. And we saw this very much so during the pandemic, where people actually took up residency in these hotels. And we're not talking about what you would think of as a hotel room. We're talking about a oftentimes cockroach infested place that has a tiny little microwave, where no towel service, where these children are forced to, heat up little Chef Boyardees in the microwave, and that's what they live on. 4 children, oftentimes trying to connect to Wi-Fi, to connect to virtual learning. I mean, the things that we saw were horrifying, but folks just oftentimes don't have another choice. And that's the hard, true reality when we have perhaps an eviction when someone has an eviction on their record, nobody will rent to them, period. And so, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying really quickly to that. I know you had something. I saw like 3 questions.
Okay.
I was gonna say, no, really quickly with the eviction piece is also understanding people that are formerly incarcerated.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm gonna say it's one of the #1 sources of incarceration is drugs. And I'm gonna say this as somebody who's treated addiction for 14 years in this community, right? But again, the majority of people who get arrested and have legal records for drugs look like me. My longest assessments on drug use look like everybody else in this audience. And I gotta say that. I know somebody looked at me like, what? Yeah. What I'm saying is that we have more drug use and drug sales by white people to white people in this community. But when it comes to incarceration, it's disproportionately Black and brown. And I can say I've worked in reinvention and recovery for the years I did. I said in private practice, working with people in Myers Park, Valentine, across the board. I've seen it all.
Yeah.
And but when that person comes out and if they move in with their family and that family has this person with that record, they can become evicted. And now all of a sudden, that's something else on their record that allows them to not potentially to be able to rent somewhere.
And not only that, and I'll stop afterwards, but if someone has been arrested as a felony on their record, they're not eligible for any of the social services that you think that they would be eligible for. So let's say you get out of prison and you want to move in with your spouse or partner with your children, you can't. Because your spouse and partner will lose her benefits. So that's something to think about.
Well, when you all educate us, it's always inspiring, but it's also frustrating because you give us a taste of all the barriers, right?
Sure.
Some are governmental, some are societal, like so many barriers. And what I don't want is for people to walk away today going,
Mhm.
that was awful. Like, there's nothing we can do. So if there's things that you can share that might be helpful, whether it's advocacy or reaching out on an individual level, anything, like, I'd love that.
So a couple of things. One, there's something called source of income discrimination. And so one of the things we know is that, people get vouchers and things like that for housing. And so they're like, well, they got vouchers. Well, one is a ridiculous wait list. Two, a lot of landlords don't take them.
Yeah.
Like, and so we have to say that again. So even with all these quote unquote systems in place, there are folks who've done everything they're supposed to do, who now they and their children are trying to move in somewhere and they got their voucher, the landlords, they don't accept them. And so one of the things that we think is really important to advocate around is, and again, the city and county have actually, we've done some space art, some work in there, is really advocating around that source of income discrimination. I'll say separately, a lot of people in here know people who are landlords. Have some hard conversations, have some curious conversations, but again, I think it's really important to be able to say, here's something we can do. There's a separate thing with our housing trust fund. One of the things we're doing, one MEC is actually working to increase the housing trust fund from the $50 million a year to at least $100 million a year. Everybody talks about how much we care about affordable housing and everything else like that. But to be able to utilize it, not only for new build, but also for NOAA projects. And again, it's challenging. Hannah and I were having some of these conversations. Again, it's tough, but the reality is we're not going to be able to build our way out of it. We're going to have to build and restore. But I'm also going to say it's important for folks who live in southern districts, as we move out 6, 7, everything else. I think it's important to say, hey, you know what? We support affordable housing in our community as well, because the reality is nobody here created the deed restrictions that a lot of us have. But every time you say not in my backyard and try to fight against it, you're doubling down on it. I think we need to hear that. Yes, no, I got that.
Back here.
Yes, we're definitely doing that. I'm good with that.
You said, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this presentation. I'm glad I'm a part of it. I've been attending First Presbyterian Sunday School for about a year, but I'm also a recipient of the Roof Above, and I've been a Roof Above recipient for some time. I've been in Charlotte, coming and going about maybe 18 years, and I can say all of what I've heard has been outstanding, and it's been the facts, but the reality is going through the experience of a mountaintop and a valley experience and divorce and having 2 homes and being raised in a home where my grandfather couldn't read, but actually he owned his own Taylor construction company with his brothers. So I was listening to these informations, and I agree with the young lady who said, I don't want anyone to go away from here hearing about all the restrictions or the barriers, because even going through this journey that I've been on through Charlotte, I realized if a person wants to help, they can help. Because one of my desires now is to be able to house women as well and to pay it forward. And if it's only tend to make sure they can get an education and a good job and own their own home, I would say my life has not been in vain. So we have to take it one step at a time. I was leaving Park Road Baptist Church this morning from the roof above, and I saw a church. Well, I saw the housing development growing around that church. And I was saying to myself, God, you know, the church has always been the pillar and the living ground of the word of truth. And so if we are Christians, or we are the ones who should bear the light in the community, it takes the church. And I had such a profound trauma hit me, because it seemed like this journey has made the church look like a mockery, as well as the things that's going on in the government. But that's another story. We're here to talk about helping people. And one of the things that I am most proud of, I have a 26-year-old son, my only child, that just got out of the military. I'm prime military, his father's sergeant major retired. However, he just got out of the military as a first lieutenant. He's 26 years old. And if I've never done anything else right in my life aside from loving God and serving him, I know that I raised my son. It was very hard as a single mother, because he and his father and I had gotten a divorce when he was 2, and he was still in the service. So I had to raise my son from Georgia to DC to Maryland to here. After 9/11, I was a former flight attendant with US Airways almost 7 years, and I moved to Raleigh, and there was great schools in Raleigh. But I came here because I wanted to broaden my horizon and get to work. But I was always a mother that was able to be attentive, and so pre-K and Head Start is definitely essential. My son was able to participate. However, I was one of those parents who was peeking out the window, sitting and volunteering. And every parent is not able to do it, but it's good for the child. So I totally agree with the 0 to 3, but I just want to be hopefully and prayerfully one of those examples that when you're helping people, you never know who they may look like, you may never know their background, you may never know, but I thank God for First Presbyterian Church, because when I came here, I felt welcome. Miss Addison was one of the first persons to make me feel welcome in Sunday school class. I told her husband that this morning, but I just don't want that burden of feeling like we can't do it because another man and this and this and that, because if we just help one neighbor at a time,
Absolutely.
you say your living has not been in vain. And there's so many things I can say, but I just didn't want to leave here with that mindset. Is who said that comment first?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that was a brilliant comment, because people hear things, but till they can see it face on, then they can attach themselves to that. You know, so after being through all that I've been through, that has been one of my greatest passions now, is to pay it forward, and hopefully one day someone else will be able to pay it forward as well, because it's getting harder. We all know inflation is happening. So it's not going to get any easier. So, but one of the things that I have profoundly learned during the roof above experience and all, if you want to help someone, you can help them. And if you want to know more about it later, you can ask me. I'll be glad to tell you. I don't want to take any more time. I thank you for giving their attention, because if we are God's children, we are to be a light in this world, and the greatest light is to give life. Amen.
Well, thank you, Miss Cynthia, for sharing your story. And I'm reminded by what Cynthia on my team told me, which is one family at a time.
Yes.
And that is so true, and such a profound statement. And, you know, one of the reasons why we started our Moms Moving Forward program, and one of the things that we are doing through that program, we've been able to create incredible community of the women with each other. But we realized that one of the ways that we're going to help our moms kind of move to that next level from an economic perspective is to connect them to folks that are not within their community, to help them build some social capital. And so First Pres has actually been partnering with us on some design thinking and understanding what that would look like. We've had our mothers from our program, as well as potential volunteers, help us to build out what that would look like. And we'd love to potentially enroll some of y'all today into that. And then the other thing that I would just say from a what can I do perspective, you know, we're also part of some policy change initiatives on the benefits cliff. Specifically the child care cliff, and which we're passing something later this year. And so if that's something that you're interested in, I would urge you to look towards Raleigh to see how you can pressure our legislator to make a difference. And finally, I would say, one of the other things that we see is that a lot of our moms, they don't have maternity leave. And they work at companies that are too small to have FMLA. And so when you have a baby, you're literally can't pay your rent because you can't work. So I would ask wherever you work to see if you do have any kind of maternity leave available for your employees. Because that might be a situation where someone has to move into homelessness because they've just had a baby, and we see that a lot. So, so those are my three things, but I agreed that, I believe that God created us uniquely for a special purpose, that every single person in this room has something that you're here uniquely, for. And we may not all look like each other. We may not all have had the same backgrounds, but I know that when we come together and can build bridges across dividing lines, that miracles can happen. And so I would encourage you to really think about what you're here for and how you might really reach out to those in our community to build those bridges.
I'll just say lastly, I think it's just about humanizing, and I definitely. And I appreciate Cynthia raised exactly what you raised, because I think what the work is both and, right? It's how do we kind of connect on an individual level, but also how do we actually challenge all of these systems and not just accept them as they are, right? Because I think sometimes that's what happens. We just kind of accept them where they are. And so I think when we talk about things like source of income discrimination, it is saying, one, talk to people landlords, and two, advocate so that people who do have vouchers can use them. Right. We're looking at code enforcement. A lot of times people think about code enforcement as something that often people do when they move into neighborhoods that push people out. Right. There's another part of the equation, which is people who have rented in things like Lake Arbor, where there's code enforcement situations where there are things that needed to get done that never happened. And the city actually has legal means to do things to enforce that. And so what we want to do is challenge the city, say, hey, you know what, let's actually, even if it means helping folks make the repairs need to happen, but let's not have people get evicted because the landlord hasn't done their job. And now we have more people who are now homeless. And so we're actually in the process of studying around the community, what are other distressed properties that are on the verge of a potential Lake Arbor, because there are more of them. And so I think that's the work. And so for us, it's saying, one, we got to understand the issue, because a lot of times we don't understand the issue. And I think a lot of us get kind of brought up things, but then we have to figure out, what do you do with it? I see Milt here, and Milton on the board of community center community transitions, and obviously John Tate is on that as well. And so a large part of that, again, was really looking at differently at folks who are formerly incarcerated. Because if we look at economic mobility, I told Brian Collier at the foundation, I was like, if you actually look at the impact of incarceration, to me, that's a whole nother cross-cutting factor that we've missed out on. Because again, when you're talking about single parent homes, things like that, a lot of it is dads that are in prison and moms as well for selling marijuana that now people have small businesses on. And those people who have small businesses don't look like people that are incarcerated. So again, I appreciate you all's time and everything else like that.
So our time is up, but please don't let the conversation end. Heather Herring, Flo, their staff members that you should stay on their radar to learn more. The advocacy's website. Lisa and I have done we're trying to get the conversation going and getting the work done. There's a lot of resources that we've added. If you want to read more, listen to more, watch the January 22nd panel that we had. We will get to this one, this recording up, tell your friends, share the conversation, and we'll keep going. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.